I'm so thrilled to introduce, I'm Biz Herman. I'm one of the co-organizers of the HSVT conference. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at the University of California, Berkeley. And I'm really, really pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Wendy D'Andrea. Dr. D'Andrea is Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology at the New School. Her research focuses on the differences between acute trauma, such as an auto accident or a single incident accident, and chronic trauma, such as things like sustained physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, and often seen in contexts like conflict and forced migration. Her lab, the Trauma and Affective Psychophysiology Lab, investigates how information processes, especially attention and cognition, are impacted by prolonged trauma exposure and reshaped through therapeutic interventions. She's also particularly interested in the physiological signature of chronic trauma and the ways in which it differs from the signature of acute trauma. She has done really pioneering research in figuring out ways to measure these things in the field in ways that are very, very relevant to, I think, everyone who's here, and getting at a lot of the methodological challenges and issues that we've discussed over the past 2 days. Her lab uses measures of autonomic reactivity such as heart rate, skin conductance, and respiratory sinus arrhythmia to investigate these kinds of differences. Speaking personally, I just want to say that Dr. D'Andrea's work has been hugely formative in my own thinking about trauma. Her openness to interdisciplinary work has been inspiring, and her contributions have pushed research and practice forward in new and vital ways. And I'm just thrilled she's able to join us, and I'm very happy to, without further ado, hand the floor over to her.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction, and thank you to the group, both for coordinating such a fantastic lineup and for including me in this very esteemed group of individuals. As my introduction highlighted, I come from the field of psychophysiology, which means that people don't usually know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to try to put forth a talk today that is accessible, and with the understanding that this may not be the group that runs out and like starts buying expensive heart rate monitors, but that you have a sense for how this work could be useful, what it may mean when you run across it, and how you would maybe enter into a collaborative sphere if that's the way that you chose to engage. So I'm going to screen share. Last time I checked, everything was working all right. All right, that's there. And there. Okay. So the work that I'm right now, we can conceive of this as a combination of a method talk and a talk that is presenting firsthand data. In terms of both parts of those work, there are multiple people whose multiple projects I'm going to be drawing some from today, and so acknowledging some of those folks is how I would like to start. This is a sort of cross-section of some of the folks who are in my lab, particularly highlighting those who have been instrumental in this work. And highlighting even further the two folks in my lab who have really done the most digging in around understanding the psychobiology of trauma in particularly difficult political contexts and community settings. So on the left is Vivian Kadari Di Piero, who has now graduated and is moving to work with Beyond Conflict. And on the right is Sarah Barenbaum, who is in my lab and completing her dissertation in the next couple of years. If you want to follow up with any questions with either of us, our contact information is here. Feel free to screenshot that, and I can send it around at the end as well. By way of introduction to the field, psychophysiology is an old and complicated field. Folks who dabble in old history of science may remember that Freud was originally a biologist or a medical doctor with a neurologist, and believed that actually biology was destiny and that everything was essentially going to finally be reduced into beeps and boops on a computer in terms of brain signals and so on. So the field that focuses on mental health and well-being had at its origin an integration with physiology, and then things parted and they got separated, and then starting primarily through the 50s, there became a much stronger interest in understanding the biology that accompanied psychological states. So psychophysiology can be thought of as the inference of psychological states through biological measures. It involves using biological measures to draw inferences about the psychological processes of cognition and emotion. As a field, this tends towards using standardized assessments, often triangulated with other measures. So you may look at how biology relates to attention. You may look at how biology relates to something more like a self-schema, or you may look at something like how biology, a biological measure, relates to something related to mental health or well-being. And through a complicated process of sort of going back and forth and measuring biological and psychological processes at the same time, we begin to develop an understanding of the biology that is corresponding to the psychology. And then we can move forward and make inferences about psychological states based on of individuals, based on what we've already sort of started to learn about how those biological mechanisms function. Does that make sense? It's sort of an iterative process. We decide that through a long testing process, we decide the biology means this, and then going forward, we can make interpretations about people or groups on the basis of that inference. In terms of how physiology happens, the steps, it's a multi-step process, and all of the steps are kind of a bit harrowing. It involves measurement that is usually fairly standardized. That involves historically has been in fairly controlled settings. And then you get a biological signal that is then cleaned and filtered, which is to say, you can imagine sort of taking out influences on the electrical signal that's been recorded that have nothing to do with physiology. And generally you would maybe have someone be looking at pictures of something upsetting for 5 minutes. And for each second, you would get 1,000 data points. So you would get whatever that is times 5 minutes times 300. And then you obviously are not going to analyze data at that level. You would then move to looking at, for example, contrasting images of people of violent versus nonviolent images, reactions to people of different races, and so on. So reducing that to manageable units. So, which is all to say, it is a lot of work. As far as a research methodology goes, it is a lot of work. Here's a sample of some of the tools of the trade. On the left is an image of a fairly simple heart rate monitor that it can attach to your earlobe. This is the exact same technology of the thing that they put on your thumb at the hospital. It's called a photoplethysmograph, or PPG. Actually, everyone knows what these are now because of COVID, where everyone goes around monitoring their pulse ox. It's the same thing. Heart rate monitors give you 2 different types of signals, which are both using my arrow right here. Over here in the center with the red circles, this is measuring the startle eye blink response. Over here on the far right, upper right, this is EEG, brain electrical activity, which gives you a signal like this squiggly business down here. And here is skin conductance or sweat gland response. Notice that is placed on, those sensors are placed on a light-skinned hand, as are most of these images, all of these images. There are some real concerns around accurate measuring of physiology across races. Down here is a measure of pupillometry, looking at how pupil dilation changes over time. And here is a representation of eye tracking, where you're looking at how the person's gaze may change over time. And the sort of most awe-inspiring of them all, this is an image of an MRI, often referred to as fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. And that gives you pictures that look like this of the brain. And everybody says, ooh, because I don't know if it's because of the pretty colors, but somehow people interpret the biological as the real, which is pretty close, which is going to be pretty relevant for talking about why we might use this work. So why bother? The short answer. People are bad at self-report. That's the short answer. It's hard for people to access their states. They're not their psychological states. They might not always know why something is happening. People are quite poor at attributions. There are changes across the developmental lifespan and so on. So why bother? The long answer. So think of those glowy, pretty blue pictures of the brains. Believability is a big piece of this. So I entered this field as a rape crisis advocate when I was 19, and I sat with people who had just been assaulted. And it was probably not surprising to people in this group that even the police who were supposed to be there to protect people did not believe the disclosures of the people who I was sitting with and who I could see clearly, obviously, acutely traumatized. That often had to do, that dismissal often had to do with people who didn't seem emotional enough, who seemed shut down and blunted, who seemed completely zoned out. And so I came to this work trying to understand more about the biology, in part so I could say that what is happening to these people is not crazy and it's not strange. And if we're going to have this cultural bias that biology is somehow more real than anything else, then I'm going to use the bias. So that's part of how I came to this work. In terms of language and cultural expression, there are not great parallels across within the mental health field across how we describe our struggles and our troubles. And so using standardized self-report tools may not actually give the best, the sort of comparable view for people to understand different perspectives and positions. People also sometimes can't access certain information. It may be stored way outside of their most immediate memory, or it may not be something they can access because it's too scary to go there. They may not be willing to tell you. That's there too. Or it may be about a process that isn't just the type of process that you describe. At the global level, data reporting changes in the presence of Western researchers. So how people report information shifts depending on who is in the room. And that's not to say that biology doesn't shift as well, but we at least get a sense of how these things would correspond. Biology is also hugely engaging. Biological measures, if you're sharing them with your participants as you're going through, is pretty engaging. So one program that we were working with, the Global Trauma Project, was in like the worst possible setup for running a program that is supposed to help people recover from trauma in an airplane hangar in South Sudan with no fans or air conditioners that was also doubling as a prison and psychiatric hospital. So they were supposed to, in this open giant room, help people recover from trauma. And and not surprisingly, people were not feeling terribly safe or engaged in that process. And so they sort of put on hold the entire training they were supposed to do and just had people come and sit down and look at their heart rate themselves and talk them through, like, look what happens when you're stressed. Look what happens when you look out at all of this stress around you. Now watch what changes when you take a deep breath. Watch what changes when you sort of put yourself in a better psychological space. See, it happens right there in your body. And it shifted the entire training so that people could find a way to regroup and organize and be present despite the fact that they were in a sort of hellscape. And then it also helps us understand more about the limits of the universality of biology. We have an assumption that everybody's body works the same way in every circumstance, and that may not be true. Okay, so what can some of these measures tell us? A bit of a sample. I've tried to unjargon this. So the sweat gland response tells us a bit about how intense a person's reaction is to a stimulus, not whether it's positive or negative, but just how intense it is. And it also gives us a sense of the novelty. Is the person, if you do the same thing over and over, we generally one should come to expect that that's going to happen again, some degree of predictability. Can someone develop a sense of predictability, and how quickly can they develop a sense of predictability? That's really relevant for thinking about threat and how people are responding to threats. Something like pupil, which is how much your pupils just wiggle over a course of time, tells us how much cognitive effort you're putting into something. So if I say 7 minus 3, your pupils shouldn't wiggle that much because that should be relatively easy. But if I say 246 minus 18.5, your pupils might start to bounce around because you're having to do some processing. So it tells us how much work, how much someone is engaging in something. The flip of that is how much are they totally dismissing it and disengaging, right? So when you want to think about a construct like dehumanization, you're thinking, if you're not seeing pupil reactivity to another human face, perhaps some human suffering, you might start to assume that someone is dismissing that other person's humanity or hasn't engaged with it. For something like eye blink, the EMG, this is a reflex that has to do with brainstem and amygdala reactivity if you're a biogeek. This has to do with whether you perceive something as positive or negative, and also whether you're getting more and more stressed over time. Things like heart rate bring us back to larger responses like fight or flight response. Also relevant here, we talk a lot about fight or flight when we think about threat and violence. Collapse and freeze are really, really relevant here. So do people actually sort of go into a frozen place where they're ready to respond but are not looking engaged, or do they go into a place that is more like a collapsed place where they're not able to protect themselves, or rather where the most protective thing they can do is nothing. Heart rate also can be, through some mathematical complexity, be used to tell us about how much someone is able to regulate their emotions. It can also tell us a bit about how flexibly people are able to respond to challenges. And it can also tell us about things that are quite relevant for this conference, how much people are able to connect to each other and see each other. So our attunement processes in social situations. And then EEG and fMRI I won't go into too much because they're expensive and hard and I don't use them. Okay, so examples of discoveries made using psychophysiology. So what did we discover about physiology, about people using physiology that we didn't already know? Here's a fun one. You would think that if you're wanting to think about moments in your relationships that are really stressful, having your parent criticize you publicly would be a really awful experience. But actually, you get the biggest stress response, not when your parent criticizes you. This is by putting people in the scanner. Not when your parent would criticize you publicly, but when your parent is infantilizes you publicly. And so people completely freak out when this happens. Brains go completely crazy. So that's an example of something we might not have guessed that we know now. Similarly, people who say that they don't care, they don't need anybody else, they're lone wolves, they don't need to connect. These are the people whose bodies show the most stress when they're alone. And this is my personal favorite. This is a study in which college men who were, this is an old study now, college men who were divided into high and low homophobia scores were invited into a study and were attached to something, a photoplethysmograph, that same light that studies blood flow, attached to their penis and put in front of gay porn. And anybody shocked, the most homophobic men had the biggest erectile responses. So these are things, we all probably knew that too, but a way in which physiology can tell us something that might not have been obvious and also can maybe further advance theory that might meet resistance in other places. Drawing from my own lab, this is working with pupilometry and eye tracking. It turns out that people who have had trauma exposure are good at looking at something, but looking right through it. So if you put them in a stressful circumstance, they can stare right at what's in front of them, but they're not actually showing any pupil response. They're not engaging. So I think about this as the little kid who is getting screamed at and being told, look at me while I talk to you, but looking at someone is the scariest thing they could possibly do. So it's a way of looking engaged while preserving and disengaging, preserving equanimity and disengaging. People who, you would also assume that people who are highly traumatized would be the most likely to have big physiological responses, but actually the more traumatized people get at some point, the less they respond. Which has a lot to do then with the ability, if you don't respond to stress, how do you take care of yourself? How do you know when it's time to step back? How do you move into a different space to protect yourself? All of that stuff. And then in terms of people understanding their, again, whether there's within the re-victimization field, if you don't know this work, people who have had childhood trauma exposure, particularly childhood sexual abuse, are very likely to also be re-assaulted as adults, which is a really sort of horrible circumstance have that double blow. And the field has talked about this as they just fail to recognize, because it seemed normal to them, maybe, they just fail to recognize that this is a dangerous situation. And using physiology, we've been able to demonstrate that that's not true at all. They recognize it really fast, and then they go into their default self-protective mode, which is that collapse mode. So they have a huge stress response at the sign of any threat, and then completely go the opposite direction. So these are things that physiology have been able to tell us that we might not have been able to, might not have known otherwise, that also have implications for how we engage with people and interact with people at the intervention and at the policy level. So moving this into the sort of more global sphere, much of this work so far has been, that I've described, has been individual work, looking at how our lab has engaged globally. We have a number of projects that we have, a number of places where we've consulted and collaborated, and I'll describe a bit about that work. These are some of the faces behind the logos for collaborators that we've engaged. So I'll give you now a sort of brief how-to guide for physio around the world. There are 3 themes that I'll outline here. One is that of productive partnerships. Another is be here now, which is how the importance of engaging engaging directly with the people you're working with. And the third is around embracing the noise and treating your noise as a valuable source of information. Okay, so I think this is probably a follow-up from and some continuity from the last talk that was happening. So if you're working outside of anything, I mean, honestly, if you're working probably in any setting, it's important to know your stakeholders and their priorities. And it becomes extremely important to be able to work very, very closely with the people who you're wanting to understand in order to be able to interpret what it is that in order to shape your question appropriately and in order to interpret what it is that you're studying. There are times we've totally swung and missed on setting up sort of the wrong paradigm to study something. So for example, we wanted to study risk and how kids manage perceptions of risk and reward. And we used a very standard task that is very common in North America and that involves monetary reward, not real money, but fake money, and did this with kids who are living in extremely high poverty situations in another part of the world. And risk and reward don't mean the same thing. You know, taking a risk to get money means something very different if that's the only money that is there. And so we really expected to see that these kids had, because there was such deep-seated violence, that kids would maybe be really reactive and overtake risks when it wasn't safe. That's not what happened at all. These kids sat on every dime. And so that's a way in which our measure didn't land because we didn't know our community well enough. And that happens. The program, if you're working with a global sort of program or in a global setting, understanding the needs and strengths of the programming, and understanding the priorities of any funding that's available, understanding how versed a group is in research and that setup is going to be an important component. And one technique we've relied on quite heavily here is that of bidirectional learning. Where it is very, very easy as North American researchers to go in with the assumption that we are going to train you how to do this. You're going to learn how to do it our way, and this is the right way. It's very easy to fall into that. And instead stepping back and really taking an approach of what works in this community, what works here, what works for these people. An example of how we've had to shift has been we worked with a group who wanted to measure cortisol, in part because cortisol is known as a stress hormone and they've heard about it. And it turned out we had to really shift because cortisol They had been, sorry, I should back up. They had been pitched on cortisol by another consultant who was going to come in and collect cortisol data. And we had to kind of shift that because it turns out that it would be really a violation of community norms to ask people to, you have to spit in a tube or cut some hair or take fingernail clippings to provide a part of their body to researchers. That would have been considered a violation. And so we had to really be very thoughtful about what would be an acceptable way of proceeding in that group. Similarly, around avoiding exploitation, there are actually laws governing how biodata are used in multiple African countries. And this is because, this has sprung up in Africa in particular, because people have taken things like saliva, not disclosed that it was being used for DNA, and then done and really very destructively come back and said like, oh, you were originally from this area and your tribe is originally not from this area, which is a really bad thing to do to a community. And so there are actually laws that govern what has to be disclosed and under what circumstances and how it has to be, that essentially a PAR approach has to be used in order to do any biodata work. And then we've already talked a bit about interpretation, but then here is being sure that this is, in terms of avoiding exploitation, that this is really brought back to the people to whom it matters, not just for an opportunity to weigh in on it, but to make use of it how it's, not just so your paper is good, you know, that's an important piece, but so that the community itself is able to make use of it in the way that is most useful for them. Some practicalities of physio out in the field. We've done this in a few different ways. Sometimes this has been done through going on site. We've done this with kids where we've made it sort of a party. And it's essentially different games that also happen to be informative for us. You know, can you guess your own heart rate kind of things is useful for getting an assessment of body awareness, stuff like that, where kids get prizes at every station, where and things like that, where so people are sort of rotating through something like that. Another has been where we have, so that's a model where we have gone on site and done the data collection. And other models have been have involved training collaborators. So training a team on the ground to learn how to collect physiological data, how to label it, how to save it, how to not stress people out more, and gone through intense training without. You know, there's a trade-off between these two. Obviously, the data carnival means that you know what happened, and you definitely know what happened. And there are sometimes surprises that come up when it's collected by the team who is maybe most close to the data. But the flip side is this is also a skills. You're providing skills to a community. You may be providing skills in a community where those skills are going to be useful for people. So we have, for example, Vivian Kadari is also on this call, and Biz Herman and I were working with Beyond Conflict in Jordan, and a number of the people who have who were trained in how to collect physiological data on the ground. I've written grad school letters of recommendation for them, saying like, this is a person who now knows how to do this scientific thing. And while I have misgivings about my privilege, this is a good place to use it to be able to support people who are going to maybe be able to access opportunities that they might not have otherwise. I've mentioned already some measures have barriers depending on the culture, the setting, how data are collected, the availability of food in a given area. So for example, cortisol, which is really popular, and I've already mentioned the cultural component that would be not appropriate with cortisol. Cortisol measures also are dependent upon the regularity of food access. And so you might not be getting an interpretable measure of cortisol if you're not necessarily, if someone doesn't have regular set meal times. Skin conductance, I mentioned before, and I'll go back to this in a second, has limitations in terms of where it's collected and how it's collected. So we've tried, for example, trying to collect skin conductance data on the beach. But the sweat gland activity is essentially measuring how salty your hands are, because that then changes how much things are conducted over two electrodes. And if you're already on the beach and everyone is dipped in salt, then you can't get a good measure there. We've also looked at trying to measure EEG measures. And one of the reasons I have misgivings about EEG is that there is currently no tool available, no EEG tool available that regularly allows scientists to collect data from people who have dreads or cornrows or other hairstyles that are common among Black participants. So they're just not included in the data. That's it. Because nobody's bothered making the right equipment. Otherwise, there are other things that have to be shifted, like how people report on their stress has to be deeply embedded within the community. Developmental epic and literacy and just familiarity with something like a Likert scale, or a 1 to 5 rating scale, has to be really considered where you are. And then I think this is for global work on trauma and violence. I think this is an incredibly important component, which is embracing the norms, or embracing the noise when your norms aren't norms. So most of these physiological measures have been tested out really, really widely, and have been this is the acceptable or expected range for a population of this age. These are if your data is outside of these ranges on this measure, it's probably not real. You're picking up some electrical signal, or your electrode fell off and you're just getting garbage or something like that. But these measures these norms were created, like a bunch of norms in psychology, off of white college sophomores in the 70s. And that's not necessarily, the universality is not necessarily what we thought it was. So even for something like sweat gland response, which is considered like the easiest thing to measure in physio, there's the likelihood of getting good sweat gland what's considered good in this field, sweat gland reactivity off of participants who identify as Black is actually very low. Similarly, people who respond that they zone out or space out, they actually don't get stressed when they're stressed. They also don't show skin conductance responses. So from a quantitative standpoint, what is often done with those people's data is it's just thrown away as bad. By the way, those are independent pathways. The zoning out is independent from the effective race. But it's just a matter of needing to the field needs to shift to be inclusive, and needs to shift its tools and its assumptions in order to get accurate data. This is at the level of like, is this data actually usable? At a different level, where this is where we reimagine our understanding of how physiology works on the basis of the data that have been collected. So this SDNN stuff is all an acronym that is related to heart rate reactivity, that is related to the ability to self-regulate. So if you look at this graph on the right, the pie chart, the majority of the sample is more than one standard deviation below global norms in a sample of South African youth. If anyone, if there are quant folks here, that's not how standard deviations work, right? You can't have more than half your sample below the standard deviation. I mean, maybe I'll leave that aside. But it means that there's something going on with this group that's not how it's supposed to, that's not functioning the way physiology is expected to function. Roughly, their physiology looked like that of, these are adolescents, looked like that of people who were in their 90s. a researcher has two decisions at this point: decide that something went wrong in the data collection and don't trust your team, or decide that something is different in the experience of this group that needs to be examined. It, to me, is pretty striking to imagine that a 13-year-old looks like a 90-year-old cardiovascularly. Okay. We see similar work with our South Sudanese folks, where it's even more profound, where the cardiovascular regulatory ability is just is low. The ability for people to calm their heart down is not present. This in North American samples looks a little bit different. In North American samples, we see actually an exaggerated ability to calm oneself down in North American Black identified participants. And the assumption has been, oh, that must be great. That's a group of people who are just not stressed, who we thought would be stressed, which is not actually what those measures tend to mean. What that winds up meaning in the North American context is likely that folks who have increased cardiac ability to calm themselves down and who also have Black skin have to calm themselves down for self-protective reasons. So yeah, it's a strength and a capacity, but it's one that also reflects a real contextual cost that weight that people are bearing. Okay. So I think I've reflected some of these things. I've reflected some of these other pieces in other parts of the talk so far, and I'll end here because I think we're close to time. So I think we're at, this is from the group that we work with in South Africa, who has created a trauma-informed surfing intervention. There's lots to be said about why surfing in South Africa. These are all coaches. None of these are pictures of kids. And this is where they are getting ready. There's a lot of fear that is related to experience. There's a lot of fear of the water that is common among people who have experienced an extremely high poverty in South Africa. There's a history to that I won't get into, but this is here an exercise where people as a group are confronting this fear. At the same time, we are sort of just coming out of this, or maybe still in the middle, I don't know where we are in it, this deep skepticism around science. And this feeling that science is something that is completely outside of us, that is just imposed upon us. And that is if science says it, then it's true, and we just have to accept it. And while as a scientist, I'm pretty sympathetic to that argument, there's also something healthy about the skepticism that people bring to the table and the questions that people are raising about the process, even if they don't necessarily have a full understanding of how the process works. And so as I'm ending this talk on the utility of psychobiology, as a tool for understanding more about trauma and violence, I also want to really encourage anyone who follows this, who goes down this road, to bring humility to it, and to bring the work as close to the people who it matters to as possible. And with that, I will say thank you for listening to me talk quickly, and I'll open it for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeAndrea. That was really wonderful. And you touched upon so many themes that we've discussed in terms of, I think participatory research has been spoken about so much over the past couple of days. And I think that psychophysiology could be a field in which it would be made even less participatory, that would be seen as a higher bar. And to be able to, I think there's something very innovative and to make it accessible in this way and to make it participatory is something that I think is not necessarily intuitive in the training that might be received in graduate programs, and to be able to do that is actually really exceptional. So I'll get us started off with one question, and people should feel free to submit their questions in the chat. But you touched upon how it's hard for people to report their own psychological states and the reasons why that might lead to self-report measures that might not accurately reflect how people are feeling or how they're existing in their bodies. And I was wondering, a two-part question, if you could talk a little bit about why people might not be able to self-report in a moment. And then also, what are some of the more striking divergences you've seen when you've collected self-report data and physio data, and what that implications that might have for research findings?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that is at the individual level, particularly when people start experiencing trauma from early in their lives, we know that, and this is true for later trauma, for acute traumas, for all sorts of stuff, particularly when people are under moments of stress, but even, under mild stress as well, people are less able to describe what their internal states are. We think of this as having multiple reasons why this may happen. One is that when you're focused on survival, talking about your feelings is just not the priority. Like, your brain is literally just doing something else at that moment. So we know from an early study by Scott Rausch, when people are put in the scanner and asked, this is a PET study, asked to recall their traumatic event, there's decreased blood flow to areas of the brain that are related to processing language. So one of the things I like to, one of the ways I like to teach the psychobiology of trauma is by listing all the metaphors that people use to describe what happened to them, and then thinking about those biologically. So anyways, your brain is doing something else. When people say there are no words for it, there are no words for it because there is no blood flow in their Broca's and Wernicke's area. Another is that in traumatogenic environments, there generally isn't great attention to helping people attune and articulate their bodily states, and traumatogenic environments tend to actually disavow the subjective experience. So there's a skill deficit there, right? So between prioritizing imminent survival and deprioritizing or devaluing of the articulation of emotion, trauma is the thing that makes it hard for people to talk about the thing. So it's a bit of a complicated scenario. In terms of discrepancies, let me think of one. Yeah, I think one of the, I don't know if this exactly gets at your question, but this is one of my favorite findings right now. We, with our Global Trauma Project colleagues who are working in South Sudan, they worked in a number of different communities and delivered the intervention across, I think, 5 different sites in the sample I'm thinking of. And the physiology in the 2 sites looked totally different, which was a little confusing because the same people collected the data, they were the same age, participants were the same age, the circumstances were largely the same, and yet at the group level, one group had extremely low, this is HRV or parasympathetic activity, and one group had extremely high parasympathetic activity. And when we brought this back to the groups, one of the things that became clear was that group with the very high HRV was in the middle and at the tail end of some conflict that had been entrenched in the community. And that group that had the extremely low HRV was in a sort of post-conflict phase, but that conflict had spanned years. And so what we believe we were capturing was essentially a burnout process of people who had mobilized and were able to fight, and essentially to bring themselves to survive, and people who had been a group of people who had lived with the violence so long that their bodies actually stopped being able to support that kind of stress response.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. And we have a few different questions coming in. Yeah.
How should we moderate the chat?
So I can read them. I'll read them aloud to you if you want. So have you encountered instances in which physiologically based methods or different ways of collecting these have re-traumatized participants or have been invasive in the ways that the data were collected? And how have you navigated these situations?
Yeah, so we've had to, this is where this has come up with in collaboration. So for example, when we did a neuroimaging study, the site where the hospital where you do the imaging often provides a technologist who sets the person up in the scanner. You're on this long table, kind of like a gurney. It's really cold. And then they have to attach all sorts of stuff to you. And we had to do a ton of training with our technologists to do this all day, every day, to not have that be a traumatic experience. Like you're taping someone's head to a table. For people who have had trauma that involves restraint, you need to really talk through that experience. And the text, we had to sort of, they were at their job and they got kind of routine, and there are these wires and stuff that go on the person, and they would drop the pile of wires like on the person's crotch because they were just laying there like a not person on a table, and then they would like be picking this stuff up, and like the person had wire, they were using the person as a storage facility because it was convenient, and we had to do a whole lot of like, not this study, not this way. So I think we were able to prevent some re-traumatization there, but it took a lot of work and a lot of collaboration. The other way in which this has gone, we get a lot of folks who, boundary setting can be a real challenge for traumatized participants. And so can stuff that might be labeled as sort of counterphobic. So we've had a lot of people who have come in and said, like, I don't want to disappoint you, I just need to do this. And it's not even about the money if we're paying, who are very, I don't want to let you down, I need to push myself through this. And we're like, no, you don't. Like it's really okay to not push yourself through this. So there are times we've had to very delicately navigate the person's own. And on the same time, telling someone you're not strong enough, you have to leave, is also problematic. So we've had to be very delicate with people about what is really best for you. You can push yourself through it. How about maybe you push yourself through it tomorrow instead of today? And be just incredibly person-centered. Yeah.
That gets to, in the last panel, we were talking a little bit about like the discrepancies between IRB ethical approval and the actual sort of like what is needed in an actual research setting and what consenting looks like in that way. And so I think that gets to that quite a lot too. It's not just a one-time consent and you're done. It's a
consent is an ongoing process.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so for Matthew, he said that you gave the example of sort of metrics and norms that were generated using undergrad samples in the 70s. Are there any metrics that are really meaningful or that are actually really meaningful or predictive sort of across contexts, so that were generated on those samples and are still predictive in context of poverty, conflict, trauma?
Yeah, I mean, like a classic example of this, if you're talking about not useful in a bunch of North American college softwares. So if you're showing low reactivity in a high stress sample, like low physiological responses in a high stress sample in another global context, you might start to develop some hypotheses about like burnout of the stress response and defenses against taking in stressful information. If you get that with a bunch of college sophomores, you just need to make sure they're not asleep. Like they might just have fallen asleep. So it's you don't want to overinterpret what has happened. You need to know video cameras are very useful for this. Yeah,
the sort of being able to be, as you were talking about, be present and be able to incorporate make sure that like the researchers are fully engaged for these things. So one other question that I sort of had was that these, there are a lot of interdisciplinary folks here, a lot of folks that might not have training in this background. And you spoke a lot about the ethical sort of concerns that come up when doing this. What are some of the ways, what are some of the policy implications and what are some of the ways in which researchers who are not from this background can incorporate this into their own studies and then sort of take that forward, especially if they are sort of oriented more towards a policy approach and making policy recommendations? Like, what are some of the things that you would say would be the minimum that they need to incorporate in their process to make sure that they're doing this ethically, and actually, especially if they're using it for policy, to inform policy?
Yeah, I think this is use the buddy system, right? Like, get someone who's willing to sit with you and explain how this works and be an advocate alongside you. If you're talking about how to translate this work, like existing literature. And the same would apply if you're talking about collecting new data. And I think, this is a nice symbiotic relationship. A lot of researchers are very cued in to the notion that the lab is not necessarily where it's at. And doing work in the real world is actually a fascinating and interesting venture. So like my colleague, Greg Siegel, wanted to study fear, and he's been studying fear in the lab for a really long time. And he decided he has a way better idea for how to study fear reactivity. He put physiological monitors on people as they went through a haunted house, which is super cool. And then he would show people their physio afterwards, and it was a really like fun kind of study. And there are a lot of people out there like that. And so if this is a direction someone's looking to move into, I think connecting to those groups is really useful. And connecting to collaborators is useful, and you're likely to find people who want to work with you on this. I will also say, like, if there are people here who are from the NGO kind of scene, we have had great luck helping people be able to really improve their funding by bringing physiology to this. It's been really useful in a lot of settings. I see, and the question here about costs of these types of studies. So the cheap, easy one is the heart rate monitor, and you can actually get a lot of information about people out of heart rate. The training is where the money goes, but the monitor itself, these heart rate monitors, you can get pretty good ones for $100 to $200. You can actually do it. I have doubts. I like you have to. It will require a little testing, but there is like your. I'm checking my phone. Your this business here, your phone camera. Can you see? You see my little ET finger? Can you, if you're looking at, if my camera is good enough, and it might not be, you might actually be able to see my heart beating. Can you see the red wiggling? Yeah, that's my heartbeat. That's how expensive it is. So then there are more steps involved in that. You need to record that, and you need to record it, but there are apps that you can do that with. So that would be like the most sort of homespun version. If you're wanting like a full complicated system, those are startup money, grant money levels, like 10 to 20,000. But simple heart rate stuff or simple skin conductance monitors are under a couple $100 usually. Yeah.
We have a question about if you're sort of, if you were giving advice, or if you were speaking with a social worker or practitioner who's working with refugee youth who experience complex trauma leading up to their moving to a new country and continue to have traumatic experiences, what would be salient ideas to share, or sort of like the information from your work?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the big risks here is going to, the gift of the situation, if you want to call it that, is that the person is going to really have a lot to bring to understanding who they're working with. And that ability to really acutely understand what someone has gone through that you're working with is really helpful for them. But the flip side is potential risk for tight over-identification and burnout. And so here, I think, again, a community is what's really important. I worked at a clinic called the Trauma Center that is no longer in existence. And it was all trauma all the time. It was called the Trauma Center. But one of the ways they prevented massive staff turnover was having nobody whose job it was to just do therapy with traumatized people every moment of the day. So people did half trauma, half admin, half therapy, half admin, half therapy, half training in the community, half therapy, half research. It's just a lot for anyone to do all day, every day. And so I think that's, I think that's where I would focus on finding a way to maybe divide time so it's not so focused, and having a community of people that you can engage with this with.
Yeah, and then a question on, are there any cultural humility trainings you've used and would recommend, or were those trainings developed more in-house, or do those need to be developed more in-house or context specific with local partners?
Yeah, so this is, again, I'll refer back to my colleagues at the Global Trauma Project, Ilya Yasevich and Anita Shankar. And I wouldn't say that it wasn't a cultural humility training, but rather cultural humility and contextualization is embedded throughout their approach. And so they work through a variety of contexts, in a variety of contexts to very, very ground up develop whatever it is that they're going to do to be supporting a community. So they use a lot of artwork in their community, in their interventions and trainings, and the artwork is created by people in the community. And part of the process of creating the training is a cultural humility driven approach that also in the exchange winds up having a lot of healing and therapeutic elements to it. And so I think they're sort of the voices in my head that I think about when I'm trying to bring that to the rest of this work.
And then one question we're asking sort of all of our panelists at the end of the session is sort of, what do you see as the future directions in sort of like your own specific field, and then sort of interdisciplinary work and sort of the intersection of the human experience of living through conflict and forced migration? What do you think sort of needs to be done, and what are you excited about as coming next?
So there are a couple different ways I think of that. One is, I think, around the issue of representation in research. And this is a method problem of actually shifting our ability to be able to study the people who we think are at most risk and have the most need to be represented, where we're not well situated to actually study them or to engage with them. That's one piece. Another piece I would add is around really understanding the parallels between what happens in the public sphere and what happens in the private sphere. So my graduate student, Scott McKernan, and I have been thinking a lot about, in his particular area of interest is around discrimination against sexual and gender minorities. And we do a lot of thinking about how the scenario of complex trauma and abuse within a family and maltreatment and emotional physical abuse in a family is actually, and how one has to adapt to survive a family in which that's common, is actually very similar to what happens at the social level of ongoing eroding discrimination. And in different ways, the same can also be said for other forms of discrimination that are racial and ethnically based, which is of course quite relevant for the question of forced migration. And so thinking about the translation between what we know, how we know what's happening between two individuals or in a small unit like a family, and how that can actually be quite informative for what's happening throughout society. So that's a place that I'm interested to see things develop.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here. We're gonna generate a breakout room for people who want to continue the conversation. We'll have it open for 15 minutes before our next and final session, which is a working group. And thank you again, Dr. DeAndrea, for being here. I think you've sort of brought a lot of people into a field in which they might not have had a lot of exposure previously, and we're really grateful for it.
My pleasure. Thank you.